Middle Ages seem to be back in fashion. We're
Right.
perpetually being told that today's coronavirus is somehow akin to the 14th century Black Death that wiped out half of medieval Europe. And now America's most foremost geographer, Joel Kotkin, who teaches at Chapman University in Southern California, has a new book out called The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, a warning to the global middle class. Joel, the coming of neo-feudalism, hasn't neo-feudalism already come about 600 years ago?
Well, I think that what the book is really about is the process that we are now in, which really is a return to the conditions, more feudal conditions, after really a long period where we were really moving away from that, in which there was, greater rationality, economic growth, upward mobility, all the things that characterize the post-Middle Ages. But I don't think we're completely there yet. And the reason the subtitle is a warning to the global middle class is to say, look, there is definitely a problem here, but if we're aware of it, maybe we can do something about it. I mean, I'm not ready to give up all hope, but I have to say that right now it looks a little bleak.
What do you mean by neo-feudalism? It's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but in your book, you're quite specific and historical in your observations.
Well, what I would say is there are several characteristics of neo-feudalism that are obviously very different. I mean, for instance, in the feudal era, you had a very stratified society. The aristocracy, which was really the sort of military aristocracy, which was the dominant class, that has now been replaced by the tech oligarchs. They're now essentially the equivalent of the old aristocracy with enormous, almost unlimited resources and ability.
So Silicon Valley is the new chivalrous class.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're chivalrous without chivalry.
Right, without the
chivalry. But basically, they are the dominant class. They have been consolidating power at an incredible rate. And actually, the pandemic has accelerated that because more of us are forced to use their mechanisms to get to where we need to go. And then we also have the rise of what I call the clerisy, which is in the old French estate, the old French First Estate. And that was really the group, it had been the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church enforced orthodoxy on society and more or less worked with the aristocracy to control society. The problem there has been that and I think this is really quite evident, that the clerisy today, which is not religious, but has the same tendencies towards orthodoxy. You can't say this, you can't say that. When you have universities that are 85, 90% of the professors are either of one ideology or are afraid to say anything about it, this type of intellectual bullying is very much in the Middle Ages. Plus, we have this enormous tendency towards apocalypse, environmental apocalypse. You mentioned the pandemic, and look, it's a terrible thing and taking a great toll, but it's not remotely close to the Black Death or even the Spanish flu. It's a problem, but everything gets blown up into some sort of the judgment of God. But in this case, it's often Gaia. We violated something and therefore we're being punished. And the only solution is to follow very specific recommendations from the clerisy, which includes, of course, a lot of the professional classes. So, those are the two dominant classes. Those are the ascendant classes, as they were in the Middle Ages. The third class, which we would call in France, they call the third estate, but really is the group that we would call the middle class, which I call the yeomanry, which are people who own small businesses, small property owners. That group is probably just almost at the point of being eliminated by the pandemic. You look at what's been closed, what kind of restaurants, what kind of stores. Very much the independents have had a very, very rough time of this. Um, and of course, they don't have the resources to go online. The McDonald's and the Chick-fil-A's and the Canes and the Burger Kings, I think they can kind of withstand this and actually even improve. Very, very difficult for an independent business. All the time I hear from people saying, I have a shoe store on Cesar Chavez Boulevard. I'm closed, but my customers can go to Target and buy shoes there. That kind of thing. But the biggest worry I have is that this yeoman class is shrinking and people are going and becoming what I would call serfs. And that is people who will never own property, will always be renters, and will be living hand to mouth for their entire existence, and will be dependent on what Marx called the proletarian alms bag. So that's sort of the society as I see it.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, Joel, about your argument, I mean, it's interesting in many ways. Well, what's particularly interesting from a political point of view is, again, without wishing to categorize you, which means I am about to categorize you, you seem to be a representative of the old left. You're particularly outraged by the profound yawning economic inequalities of our age. And yet you also see perhaps in ideological terms, both the green movement and what's called cancel culture within the university, or the identitarian political movement within the university, as being ideological props of this neo-feudalism. Is that fair?
Well, because what you do is, first of all, how feudal can you get to classify people by their race and gender? This idea that you represent not yourself, which is really very much a bourgeois liberal idea, to you represent a group, or you're part of a group. And I think that this is part of the whole problem. We don't view people as as independent agents. One of the real accomplishments of the middle class revolutions of the 17th, 18th, 19th century, and then even further into the 20th, was this idea that the individual was sort of had free agency, could rise up, could fall down, was being judged by who they were. Now, was that perfect? No. I mean, there was certainly discrimination, but you think about all the discriminated groups that came out of, let's say, the United States in the 20th century, who had been discriminated against: Jews, Japanese, Chinese, Indians, groups that had been consistently repressed. And here in California, the Asians really had it worse than the African Americans did. And yet they've all been able to move up. Even in the question of race, people say, well, if you have, some of these groups have lighter skin, but Africans are doing very well in the United States. Immigrants from Africa, people from the West Indies have done pretty well. Obviously, many Indians are very dark also. So I think that what's happened is we've forgotten the idea of free agency. We've forgotten the idea of sort of the individualism that is at the key to the Constitution, to democracy, almost everywhere. The old radical theorist Barrington Moore had a great little aphorism, which was no bourgeois, no democracy. So if, let's say, we have a country which as the oligarchs would probably see it, where it's a very small group of people basically dominate and control the economy. They control the means of communication. They control the content, and basically everybody else is basically a serf, who's going to sit around and hope that Mark Zuckerberg can get $2,000 a month into their bank account so that they can live minimally.
Joel, another piece of your argument that I was struck by that I think is really intriguing, I'm not sure everyone will agree, is that in your comparison between the neo-feudal world and the early 21st century, you say both are marked by the profound hypocrisy of the upper class. We all know, of course, about the upper class in the medieval world pretending to care about the underclass and, of course, being enormously, unimaginably privileged. You're suggesting the same is true today. While I was reading that, I was thinking of Ivanka Trump and her remarks about people finding new work and being like one of the members of the French aristocracy before the revolution, the wife of Louis XIV, who spoke about the peasants eating cake. Where's the real hypocrisy in today's upper class, in this oligarchy or this clerisy?
Well, how do I count the ways? I mean, if we think in the environmental movement, and this has been true of the environmental movement from the beginning, it's always been against the middle class consumption, with no idea that their consumption is infinitely larger. So you have the Leonardo DiCaprio, I'm going to fight climate change and I'm going to take my private jet to New York every week. Or I remember I spoke once at an environment conference for the Wall Street Journal, and the organizer told me that they had a problem because so many private jets were coming into Santa Barbara from Silicon Valley. So here are the people telling, Mr. Rodriguez, well, you can't have a single family home. You can't use natural gas. You can't do this. You can't do that. Meanwhile, these people taking private jets. Does anyone see the problem here?
But Joel, is that really fair? I mean, you can always find a degree of hypocrisy. Are you suggesting that the entire clerisy in our increasingly divided America, that they're deeply hypocritical?
I was really thinking more of the oligarchs. The clerisy really varies. There are some at the very top who may have some of that kind of privileged position, but many of the true believers tend to be in the clerisy. They're university professors, the media, which is, as an old journalist, I find just absolutely horrendous in its, slavish conformity.
When you say an old journalist, you mean you're old and you're a journalist, or you're an ex-journalist?
No, I still consider myself a journalist, but I am unfortunately also old. So but I think that what you have is you have people who, or even within the clerisy, they'll say, well, we want to impose this and this restriction, but I work for the government, or I'm an administrator of a hospital, or I'm in some sort of privileged position where I'm not really affected the way, let's say, a oil worker in Bakersfield or a truck driver might be affected. So there's a lot of hypocrisy, but the super hypocrisy is in the oligarchs, and the oligarchs, they just don't see it. Like, they'll support policies that, let's say here in California, we don't want people to have single family homes. We want them to live in dense apartments in the city. Meanwhile, how many houses does Mark Zuckerberg have?
He bought up his whole neighborhood.
Right, exactly.
Or Jack Dorsey, who decides to take 6 months off in Africa and fly all the way there.
I mean, this is so much of, if you read de Tocqueville's accounts of the French aristocracy,
right?
And then you have them. Their strategy politically seems to be, we're going to buy off the opposition, any potential opposition. So, you tell me what logic is there that Amazon gives money to Black Lives Matter, who are basically a bunch of Maoists, essentially. If you look at their ideology, that's what they are.
Who, Amazon or the Black Lives Matter?
But Black Lives Matter. But so
I mean, again, I'm not convinced, Joel, that's entirely fair. But let's move on to
read their position papers.
Well, but there may be some members of the Black Lives Matter movement who are Maoists, but not everyone out on the street are Maoists. Most of them haven't.
No, not the people. Well, a lot of the people on the street come from and a lot of people very well intentioned are out in protest. But if you read their positions and you listen to interviews with their leaders, they're not hiding anything. So you have this odd situation, like before the French Revolution, a lot of the aristocrats supported the sort of enlightened revolutionary ideas. Only at the end of it, they ended up in the guillotine. I mean, what's really quite hilarious is that there were a bunch of, there was some video of a guillotine being set up in front of Bezos's own house. Now, I don't know if that was Black Lives Matter, but it was certainly people from the left. So, what I think you have is an attempt to buy off the opposition. And look, there are certain issues. If I'm an oligarch, environmental issues, gender issues, saying I'm against racism. But are you actually going to do anything to address the real economic issues? And I appreciate I am sort of an old social democrat. If we want to help people in the inner city, well, why don't we think about jobs? Why don't we think about skills? What do we think about building better housing so they don't live in crowded, dilapidated conditions? But those are not the demands that we hear today. And really, if Amazon or Apple hired a bunch of people of color in executive positions, and exactly what has been improved? I mean, these were people who were going to get jobs anyway. What you have to ask yourself is, what would happen in Fresno if Tesla built its next factory in Fresno? That would make a difference. That would be infinitely more important than the demands of Black Lives Matter. And then obviously on top of all that, the funding the police, as Willie Brown said, is one of the stupidest slogans ever concocted, because people are terrified. One of the big problems we have in our cities is that crime has come back very much like the Middle Ages. You almost have to have private security.
Well, the privatization of life, I think, is a very interesting element in your argument. And you made your reputation as an urban geographer. I think one of the more convincing aspects of your argument lies in urban geography. You're based in Southern California. I'm up in the Bay Area. And when you walk around San Francisco, as you note in your book, you really are returning to a medieval tableau of enormous wealth, which is guarded and private, and then the streets teeming with homeless people and hungry people and crazy people. It's almost as if when you go to San Francisco, it reminds you of the imagery of Bruegel or some other
yes.
medieval artist. So is it in the cities that we are seeing this return to neo-feudalism most
I think
clearly?
Where it's most clear, particularly. And it's interesting, the cities which have had some of the worst circumstances in the last 5 to 10 years, San Francisco, Seattle, Minneapolis, Portland. What's interesting is these are considered to be high-tech, highly, a lot of educated people. They also happen to be the whitest cities in America, Portland in particular. And yet they have the craziest politics. But I think what you're seeing in urban areas, as the middle class has left, middle class values still exist in the suburbs and exurbs. In the cities, there is no familial middle class. They're very small. You look at cities like San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, Manhattan, in terms of New York, they have almost no children. There are very few families. I mean, it's really divided between this sort of upper class, including a lot of young people, and the very, very rich, and then a large number of poor people. And as you mentioned, the real, what you might call lumpen proletariat, the homeless.
So what are we going to do about it, Joel? You say it's not formalized yet. It's on the horizon, or perhaps even closer to us than on the horizon. It's in our cities. But you argue that it's not inevitable, that we still do have agency to change this. Well, how do we confront neo-feudalism? How do we turn back this disturbing tide? I don't think anyone's watching this wants to return to neo-feudalism.
Well, I would say you would have, and I think this is really important, you have to have some sort of attempt to either break up the tech elite, the top 5, 6 companies, break them up, or they have to be regulated as utilities. At this stage of the game, you look at a company like Microsoft, which majors in crappy software, but they can get away with crappy software because there's not much of an alternative. I mean, there's Apple, which is small. You have companies like, what scares me the most of all, you have companies or entrepreneurs taking over the dissemination of news, deciding what you can see and what you can't see. So, which tends to reflect, no offense, a kind of bizarre Bay Area view of the world, which is very, very censorious, sort of progressivism. Everybody I know in our business is terrified that Google's going to knock you off. You're not going to be in YouTube. You're not going to be on Facebook. I mean, I have friends who have been, basically taken off. There's no way that they're racist. But they disagree with the party line. So I think that we have to diminish the power of the oligarchs. One of the things that was so wonderful, I covered Silicon Valley in the 80s. And what was wonderful about it is it was very competitive. There was a time when there were 40, 45 disk drive companies. Now, eventually there weren't 45, but in that process, fortunes were made, technological improvement. I mean, one of the reasons why the software doesn't get much better is you have monopolies. Why does Google want to make their service better? I would say in some ways their service is worse because they both politicized and commercialized their search results. So in the old days, it was really a very nice, pure program. That's why it did so well. We're seeing this over and over again, that the tech oligarchs seize a market, very often using the idea that they have so much capital that they can afford to lose money for years and years, wipe out everybody else, and then take control. So that's one thing. Second of all, absolutely has to be a rejection of the cancel culture and the censorious nature of the university and the media. I mean, one of the scariest things, I don't know if you read Barry Weiss's recent letter or Andrew Sullivan. Now, we're not talking about, the Hitler Youth here. We're talking about people who are, fairly liberal, and in Andrew Sullivan's case, I would say basically a progressive himself, unable to deal with the kind of the culture at Vox, which is so, censorious and so controlling. So you've got to deal with that. Then you have to change the economic priorities in this country. One thing is to reshore more manufacturing from China. Moving all our production to China is a geopolitical and economic disaster for large, and particularly for large parts of this country. Our education system, we are increasingly more interested in indoctrination than education. I don't know if you teach, but the knowledge level of the kids going to college is so bad now. I mean, yes, they probably are a little bit better at running PowerPoints. I'll give them that. And they sometimes use video well. But you ask them a question about how do you talk about feudalism to people who don't know what feudalism was? I mean, I literally
one way, Joel, finally, one way to teach people is to read books. You mentioned to me before this interview that your family owned Shakespeare's books on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, where I live, one of the famous old bookstores, which no longer exists. Everyone should read The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, which is a very provocative book. I think most people won't agree with everything in it, but I think there's stuff in it that's really important, and I'm really impressed that you've said it. What else should people be reading? You're stuck down in Orange. What Orange County? What are the books or a book or two that people might read in the lockdown that will make them more enlightened, that will make them see what you're arguing?
Well, there's a terrific book called The Fate of Rome by Kyle Palmer, which talks about the role of climate and particularly pandemics in the collapse of the Roman Empire. It's a really quite good book. It's an old Gibbon fan myself. It added a whole nother picture of what was going on. The Great Influenza by John Barry, I think, is a very good cautionary tale. Plagues and People by William McNeill. I would say those are three that I would really look at to get some idea and some perspective. Like one of the things that if you read all those books, you see the role of globalism and trade and congestion and crowding in making pandemics work, and how they spread, and then what was the effect of them. Those three books I would really recommend.